So I don't know what it says that you came back, but thanks. Yeah, thank you. Tonight, the focus is going to be really on what does it mean to live out this atonement stuff we've been talking about, and how does that play, and how do we continue to play with it in our everyday lives. And so, for the most part, I've not stayed really close to the text in this class, if you may have noticed. But tonight, I'm going to use the framework that he has, because I think it's just a helpful framework of how do we put atonement into action, and use that, and then we can jump off of that and play with other ways. And then I'm, God willing, going to be less long-winded than I've been previously, and then we can just have some more conversation if questions come up and things like that you would like to dialogue more about. I'm going to do my best to make sure we have plenty of time for that. We do these classes at least twice a year, sometimes 3. I think there's 3 on the books this go around. The next one is going to be discussing the kind of problematic frame of reading scripture from Western eyes. And so we're going to play with that a little bit. There's a great book that we're going to use as kind of the centering place for that. That'll come post-Easter as we kind of head in towards summer period, and we'll do that. So looking forward to that one. And then there's a fall one as well that is in the works. So hello. Welcome. So here we are, the final class. Maybe it feels for you that it just started, and maybe it feels like you've been attached to a fire hose with stuff shooting into your brain for the last 5 weeks. Either way, this is the moment when we kind of take a step back and ask, what does atonement do? Not just what it means, but like, what does it do in us? What does it evoke? What does it challenge us with? Because part of what our text that we've been working through has, and what McKnight's been working with us in, is that atonement is not just an idea. And it's not just something God did for us. It's also something that we do with God. It's praxis. It's an invitation. It's a calling. Which means we need to ask some real world, feet on the ground, what does this mean Monday morning questions. So how does this atonement shape our call to justice and mercy? We talked last week about these whole liberative movements and theologies and their call to us that somehow this has got to be connected to justice. So how do we connect it to justice? What does it mean to be an atoning people in our world? I remember my first Lent as a Lutheran pastor, and it was Ash Wednesday, and I remember that I literally cried through every time I spoke, "Your sins are forgiven," over each person I got to do that with. In my previous practice, that wasn't a part of who and what I was. But what does that look like? And how do we actually live this stuff day in and day out? So that's where we're going to go today. Beyond our personal salvation, which I think is how many of us were handed conversation about atonement. So what does atonement as justice and reconciliation and peacemaking look like? So Jesus enters the synagogue, and you can imagine the room was like it was when I stopped everybody from talking, full of buzz with expectation. And Jesus takes the scroll, unrolls it with care, and begins to read the Torah portion for the day. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he rolls up the scroll, puts it back where it was supposed to be, and sits down. And then, after being seated, he says, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." That's a mic drop. Right? First off, a young, not known as rabbi person in this moment, playing with the scroll. If you want to get punched in your face, go to a synagogue and touch the scroll without the rabbi asking you to do it. They're expensive. They're thousands upon thousands of dollars. And they're handled with deep care and reverence and appreciation. Not that Jesus didn't do that. I'm sure he did. But then to read a text and to say, "And now it's fulfilled in your hearing," is a pretty big statement. It's not just an announcement. It's a provocation, right? It's a disruption. Jesus is standing in front of people who've been waiting for centuries for the fulfillment of this prophecy. The oppressed, the broken, the expectant, his people Israel. They've been waiting for somebody to finally make things right. And now Jesus says, it's happened. It's fulfilled. Right now. With me. So this is, in modern terms, Jesus' mission statement. This is atonement in action. And Jesus nowhere in here says, "And if you pray this prayer, you'll end up in heaven today." It's not about personal salvation in this moment for him. It's not just about where we go when we die. It's about setting things right here and now. It's about restoration of people, of systems of community, of creation itself. And atonement isn't just a transaction where sins are wiped away in some cosmic legal exchange. Atonement has to be transformative. It's God's great act of reconciliation, healing what's been broken, redeeming what's been lost, and setting the world back on the path it was always meant to walk. So this is what Scott McKnight is getting at in a community called Atonement. If atonement is only about personal salvation, then it's incomplete. Because God's mission, the mission of Jesus, in whose way we say we follow, was bigger than that. Atonement is God putting the world back together and inviting us to participate. So part of what atonement and justice and how they play together engages is atonement is not just a vertical relationship between me and God. Atonement is also a horizontal relationship between us and each other. And that's why Jesus' ministry was not just about preaching, but also about healing and feeding and forgiving and confronting injustice, which we see this again and again in the scriptures. In Micah 6:8, even before Jesus came into this place, what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Or James, after Jesus, you show me your faith, and I'll show you my works, because faith without works, it's dead. Or Jesus in Matthew 25, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. There became a point in kind of the Christian arc of history where justice became an optional choice in our faith life. Right? We just didn't talk about it. In fact, there's a whole book from kind of the evangelical space called A Hole in Our Gospel. And it's the previous, I think, CEO of World Vision. Thank you. And he, in his own journey, realizes that this good news that we're teaching has left out justice. And in doing so, we're missing a whole bunch of what Christ has for us. So justice isn't an option in our life and faith. It's the evidence of a reconciled heart, the outward sign of inward transformation. It's our understanding. So if our understanding of atonement doesn't move us to action and compassion and the pursuit of justice, then we misunderstood it. That is what our feminist sisters and our liberationist brothers and sisters are saying to us. And we may be really uncomfortable by the things they're saying to us. But what atonement requires of us is that we listen and that we pay different attention. So not only is it about living into a life of justice, this work of atonement, but it's also a work of reconciliation, of healing what's been broken. Right? Paul says you have been given the gift of reconciliation, that followers of Jesus, this is what we're supposed to be doing. I think we can all name very clearly over the last few months that we live in a fractured world. We're fractured by racism, by poverty, by violence, by economic disparity, by political division. And yet, Paul says in 2 Corinthians, all this is from God who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So the church, in its very call of atonement, has to be uncomfortable in this division. It should be stirring our blood in ways that makes us even more uncomfortable. And reconciliation is not just something that we receive, it's something we're called to do. Atonement reconciles us to God so we can walk in God's presence free from the stuff of sin that we feel in that space. But part of what sin is a breach in relationship. Right? James Keenan, one of my mentors, says that sin is the failure to bother to love. He says the world has spent way too much time thinking about the sins they already feel bad about, and that we get distracted from what really matters, and that's that we're not even concerned and awakened to all the places where there's breaches in love in our relationships. So this atonement calls us to a reconciliation to one and another so that we can be the kind of people who break down walls and build larger tables instead of building up walls and creating further separation. But it doesn't just start and stop with people. It's also about creation, right? There have been breaches in how we treat our world that we're living out the consequences of, that because somehow we were handed a theology of dominion, we think that means something separate than care. And that's a part of this call as well. That we care for the earth versus exploiting it. It's not an accident that when Jesus died, there's this metaphor or real life reality that the temple veil tore in two. That was not just a symbol of access to God, it was a rupture of division. That Jew and Gentile, insider and outsider, rich and poor, all of those barriers were released. But it doesn't stop there, right? Our atonement in action as individuals in our work and communities in our work. It's also about peacemaking, right? This radical invitation Jesus didn't just proclaim the good news of peace, he embodied it. He ate with sinners, welcomed the outcast, touched the untouchable, loved those in society that had been discarded. But guess what, people? He also ate with the Pharisees. This is why Paul in Ephesians 2:14 says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." And when he teaches us in the Sermon on the Mount, he doesn't call us to be peacekeepers. He calls us to be peacemakers. Those are very different frames and phrases. The atonement calls us to be that peacemaker, not just people who hope for peace, but people who are actively creating peace. So what does that look like today? It's going to mean standing in solidarity with the oppressed. It means listening to stories of the marginalized. It means listening to people's stories who are radically different than our own and trying to understand even when we have a really hard time wrapping our head around it. It means advocating for justice, not just as a theory, but in actual practice. It means choosing relationship over division. It means choosing mercy over vengeance. It means choosing humility over pride. Right? Atonement isn't passive. It demands something of us. So let's stop there for a second and talk about what all this means. How do you hear these things? How do you we've given all of these metaphors and theories and how the metaphors work their way into practice, and that's beautiful, but if it doesn't move us, right, that's really the point. If it doesn't move us, then pick a different metaphor, because you got plenty. And if you don't find one, then for God's sake, create one. Because this work is that important. So, thoughts, ideas, practices that you see? Please.
So you mentioned the story about the scroll, and one thing I noticed about that a while back was, it says in the text that they became furious with him, and they sought to kill him, right? Which is weird the way that we normally read it, because he comes along and says, "Hey, I proclaim to you a time of really wonderful stuff. It's going to happen right now," and then they're like, "Kill him!" Why? And I think it's because he stopped the quote mid-sentence. The rest of the quote is, "and the day of the Lord's vengeance." He leaves that part out. And therefore, one thing you can kind of conclude from that is they are looking for a Messiah who comes and gets vengeance for them against the Gentiles, against their enemies. And so as they heard, like, hey, it doesn't have to be punishment, they're like, well, we want there to be punishment, right? And because they're righteous and they want punishment for the unrighteous, which is them. And so Jesus' understanding of his mission is not to bring about that kind of justice.
Yeah.
And also in Romans, too, like Paul is not talking to Martin Luther and is not saying, hey, you have a guilty conscience, let me assuage your guilty conscience. He's saying, you, again, want wrath for your enemies. Stop wanting that. That's a bad deal. If you want wrath, you're going to get it for yourself, too. You're not innocent. Look at all the things that you do. You're a complete hypocrite. You're not innocent, and you are just as much a sinner as these people who you're calling sinners. In fact, they're actually better people than you are, et cetera, et cetera. That's like Romans 1 through 3. And again, it's I guess the coming around to it is that when we talk about justice, right, there's different types of justice. There's retributive justice, And
Restorative
that's what
justice.
they wanted at the time. That's what Paul's audience in Romans wanted. And that is what my background is as an evangelical. That's what the evangelicals want. They want vengeance. They want retribution. They want to storm the Capitol. And I think that goes to, like you kept saying to us, like, how does this affect how we see God, and how does it affect what we live, and we're supposed to take on being like God.
Mm-hmm.
And so if God is vengeful and demands punishment, then shouldn't we? And so it kind of fits that that's what they do, that they're pro-violence, pro-punishment in God's name. And if you see justice as, you were alluding to with the, the feminists and the liberation people, it's a different kind of justice. It's it's a restorative justice, justice of making things right. And it's like you become the way that you see God.
100%. Right? Like, I thank you so much for those words, sir. That's why these things matter so much, right? Our theology shapes us. We are not separate from it. If you think you are, again, I was saying to somebody else this last week over lunch, I said, tell me how you define sin, and I will tell you virtually the rest of your theology from there. Tell me how you understand God, and I will tell you the rest of your theology there. There's something that happens in us as we play in these sandboxes, and we set parameters that then often A plus B equals C, but not always, right? So like there's a lot of beautiful evangelicals out there who were not January 6th wrath people. My family being one of them, right? Who thought that was crazy. And their idea of God is different than that. And so, and yet there are those who are. And I think often it's because they don't even know there's other options in our sacred history of which to play. And that part of the work of justice is for people like myself and Billy who code switch in these territories because that's how we grew up, and still have to be in deep relationship with the other, then you part of my work in justice in those spaces and restoration in those spaces is to give other options. Like just last week, my best friend's a doctor in the hometown I grew up in of 2,500 people, and we spent like an hour because he's watching these classes. And he's like, I just wish people could grasp it. And I'm like, but again, there's none of this is being taught in their world. And not that like knowledge frees everything, but knowledge sure as hell helps in the process of some of this. And I think it goes back to Yulia's comment the first week is, yeah, all the metaphors are here and they're all usable, but we also have to be careful about what they produce. And we have to be willing. Part of justice is saying penal substitutionary atonement, as it's been played out in our world currently, has been really produced really dark results. And we have to be able to name that, right? And say that. That's part of this work. Yeah. And I also think part of why they wanted to kill him is because, if somebody came into our church on Sunday and claimed to be the Messiah, I would have had a lot of coffees the next week. They may not want to kill them, but they might have some things to say about it, right? Like there's chaos in the radical nature of what Jesus was doing. Yeah. Others? Sorry, here then here. Wayne, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I wanted to thank you for class and this journey. Atonement is, wasn't like on my top list of. We talked about poverty or guidance. And what I have come to see is how this is kind of a Rorschach test. That atonement is one concept that is reflective, as you were just saying, of pretty much everything else. And what I see in it is what I bring to it. So that's been a bit humbling. I also wanted to call out the book of the gentleman who just made comments before.
Derek Scratt.
Because I read it this week, and we just happen to be sitting here with the guy who wrote a book that's really worth reading.
It's very good.
Personally, important to me because I had not seen how shaping this topic, three-syllable word, which I don't use in other parts of my life, what this means. And as you've been saying in the 4 questions, atonement is kind of like a one-word summary of who do you see yourself as being and who is Jesus? And why does it matter? Okay, that's a longer way of saying atonement, but that's really what it means, I've come to see. And I've also made it through this week. What happened to Mars Hill? So there's a church that had a history, and I just listened to several hours of that history. And what I saw in it was the power of the vision of who Jesus is in shaping absolutely everything. And it leads us to the disconnect that we're living in now, where I believe there are, let's say, Jesus-loving people, not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but there are some Jesus-loving people who are doing things that are just reprehensible to me and inconceivable. But they're doing it from seeing, in a sense, a different side of Jesus, they might say, or a different Jesus, I might say. And so who Jesus is here and what he did, and you're even taking this from at the beginning, I'll close with this. You're at the beginning saying 4 or 5 weeks ago that this is a look into the work that we're doing and why we're here and what is the role of Jesus in this is very true. And as a result, it's kind of like, what are you doing here on earth? What's your mission? Where are you going? And it all kind of comes out of it. So I appreciate your just, raising the topic. Thank you, Derek. Amazon, just saying.
Yeah, it's a great book. And I will tell you as, and I'm sure he hates this, so I will say it shortly. As difficult as Scott McKnight's book is to read, is the exact inverse of how simple, not in theology, but in reading, that Derek's book is. And so...
It's called Healing the Gospel.
And it's one of 2. I haven't read the second one yet, but I finished the first one, so I look forward to the second one. Yes.
This is way simpler than any of these. I also got your book, started it. I agree, it's so clear, it's concise, it's deep. Question about atonement. I'm realizing growing up, I didn't think of the atonement as anything that had anything to do with me, other than I knew about it, and I didn't understand, I of course knew that how important it was to my faith, but I've never thought of atonement as something continuing into my life, although it makes so much sense.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's there were systems of theology that you and I and others were handed where to confess the idea that we had something to do with it would have been apostate. And I mean that just in like, what do you mean you have a part in this? Like, this is God, Jesus work, not humanity work. And there's been theological pathways that some of them we've talked about in here, and many others that we haven't talked about, that actually call that out, that like, no, it does have to do with us. We are created co-creators alongside God. Like, hang out here for Lent, and you're going to get sick of hearing these words from me as I talk about sin and grace over the next 8 weeks.
One more comment.
Yeah.
That I feel compelled to make, because I'm beginning to realize I had an evangelical background, but not the type that is talked about in here at all.
Yeah.
It wasn't a God of wrath. It was all just, it must have been a blend of a whole bunch of these theories, because that's just not.
My God wasn't wrathful either.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I've told this story before. One of my earliest memory that I may have early ones, but I don't remember it as gutturally as I was 4 years old, and a team of teenagers had come to do what was called a disciple now. I don't know if you guys have that in your world, but it's basically a group of teenagers come and they lead your teenagers in a retreat weekend, and it's amazing, and you get to meet all these like older teenagers and all that. Well, I'm a pastor's kid, and at that point I was a youth pastor's kid, and so I got to do what they did. And the end of that Disciple Now was they got to go night swimming at our community pool, and my dad took them, and I was like, Dad, let me go with them. And you know, I'm the 4-year-old riding in the back of the bus, and what could happen? It's such a safe space. And the conversation was, you know, Rusty, do you know where you're going to go when you die tonight? And then a big explanation of hell and all these things. And I got out the bus crying, and my dad was like, what is wrong with you? And I was like, I'm going to hell. And he's like, no, you are not. God, when? Yeah, that's it, yeah. And no, you're not. God loves you. This is not the story we tell, right? So even growing up in the Southern Baptist world I grew in, that wasn't a theology I was handed. Now, I did learn to absorb some of God's wrath as I got older, but that's why I think it's really important. The fullness lies on the other side of complexity, not simplicity. And I think our world keeps telling us that things, if we just simplify them, then it's better. And I call bullshit to that. Complexity matters. If you were to poll each person in this room about their faith journey and how that played and how they grew up, you would have, however many people are in this room, a different theology. And some of you grew up in the same home. Right? In the same system. If you were to talk to my brother, my sister, and myself, my sister's 8 years older than me, my brother's 4 years older than me, what they have received about their faith is radically different. If you talk to Mr. Serrano, whose twin brother is also a pastor, you're going to see different things that they received from that, right? So it's important to lay this out as well, and to be really careful that we're not othering in the process of trying to grow, that we're delving deeper into that space.
I tried really hard to not talk tonight.
Oh, stop it. Just talk.
I was trying to think of a way to say this that didn't come across as defensive or anything like that. But my daughter came out to us as gay probably 8 years ago, and we learned very quickly that vocabulary mattered. And so I appreciate what you just said at the end, right, about not othering people that have a different viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Sharon and I have been here for 2 years, love the church, love everybody. One of the things we're trying to do is learn about different ways to see things, different perspectives, different
theologies, different doctrines, different way to view the world, right? Because we came from an evangelical background and didn't have a wrathful view of God or anything like that. And I do want to read your book. I'm very interested, and I've always appreciated what you've said during these lessons. But one of the things that struck me was, I would just like to say, not a warning, but just kind of a like observation. It is othering, you know, when we use phrases like, you know, evangelicals and storm the Capitol, evangelicals, or you know, wanting, you know, bloodthirsty or whatever. It's shaking, you know. So I've been a pastor for 30 plus years. I'm trying to learn more. I'm trying to learn how other people view the world. And we often feel othered, you know, just frankly.
Yeah.
I don't say that to say woe is me or anything like that. I just try to bring out a point like there are people that are trying to see the world differently and to learn. And if we aren't careful, just like we didn't intend to harm our daughter with some of the language that we used. But it was, we've changed our language. We've changed the way we spoke. I would just like to bring that to maybe people's attention that may not see it that way.
Yeah. And there's this interesting piece, right? I thank you so much for sharing that, because I think it's, first off, it's courageous. And second, it is eye-opening in the sense of how we talk matters, and especially when we're having conversations around restoring. But there's also another side that is important of the justice language, right? So one of the things that James Cone says is, you cannot know Jesus unless you're black. He is not talking about, lest you miss it, your skin. He's talking about your suffering. And that was like a kick in my face when I first heard it. So there's the both and, right? We can't be afraid to challenge. I think one of the struggles in Christianity was, for many people in the US, the very first time they realized there's competing views of Christianity was when the Episcopal bishop led the prayer service. And they realized, oh wait, there's one way to see this, that we're asking somebody to be merciful and just, and that this is not a call of attack on the president. It was a petition, right, of what she believed about the personhood of Jesus and the way of Christianity. And there was this radical response on the other side. And I do think there is an awakening where we have to be louder about there's another way. I think we have to be careful about how we do that. Or, right, like one of my mantras that Billy and I talk, I'm outing you and I, Billy, sorry. Like one of the things that we talk about is in our sphere of code shifting and those things is fundamentalism is fundamentalism no matter which side it's on. And it's all destructive. There are many in my tradition that are fundamentalist in their wokeness in a way that it's just virtue signaling that doesn't mean anything and isn't doing anything to make the world a better place, right? So there's this, like, there is this really important line that you're calling out of saying, hey, like, be careful about our language, and also hear the complexity of talk louder, say more, don't stop pushing, because we actually do have a multitude of competing frames of the Jesus narrative living in our world right now that need to be challenged a bit. And so how do we hold that balance, I think, is a part of what Atonement is asking us.
Yeah, I think also recognizing inside the house. It's not a them, either whatever fundamentals you want to choose. It's not them versus us, but
It's us.
Yeah, it's the church, right? Like it's all in the house together, out of love.
And I think it's been a long time since the church has understood their oneness in a way that we've stopped talking to each other, right? Like, there are churches that I have made an attempt to sit with their clergy in our community who won't sit with me. And to be super frank, we had a prayer meeting here with a mixture of churches, and I was so traumatized by that prayer meeting that Mike will tell you it was 2.5 weeks before I wasn't shook. And so it is this dance, right? It is in our house, and there are deep emotions rooted in these realities. Billy.
One of the quotes that I've been really convicted by just in the past 4 or 5 months, King Wilber is a philosopher, and he says, we are made to transcend and include. That the transcendence of the spaces that we came from doesn't necessitate vilifying those spaces, right? There's a way to move beyond them and to honor them and to love them. I think of Kate Bowler's book, Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies I Have Loved. Right? There's a love of those things. It formed us. It gave us foundation. It gave us a lexicon, a language to move forward in faith. But at some point, it stops working. Right? Something happens in our lives, whether it's suffering or trauma or whatever, where it no longer serves us. And it's just because it doesn't serve us anymore. And there's more room to grow and to move through. But to then turn, I think that's the flaw, is to turn around and vilify the spaces that we came from emphatically. Right? We can name where they do harm, we can name where they do wrong, but to vilify them across the board, I think is incorrect. Richard Rohr's book, The Wisdom Pattern, he says, we define ourselves by what we are against and not what we're for. Right? What happens when we step into the what we're for and stop thinking so heavily about the things that we're so against?
Thank you. Yeah, it's good. The other thing I would just add to that is a sense of grace for each of us. One of the kind of teachings of spiral dynamics is as you're moving throughout your life and growing and transforming, that you always look back at the place you were just last with deep suspicion. And it takes the next movement before you can look back at it with deep grace. And so I think, there was a moment in my journey where I didn't know how to do anything but just be radically suspicious and angry and frustrated. And now I look back with deep love for where I came. Like, I am who I am because of the roads that I've walked to get to this place. And the people that walk them with me, and so also in this, like, we're gonna get it wrong, people. Like, we're gonna mess it up, and we're gonna hurt people, and that's when we have to, like, one of the things I've loved about watching the two of you with your daughter is the work you're doing to not only be different people in the presence of God, but to just be different for her. Right? Some of it that you may not even still agree with, right? There's things that you're having to bend and move because you're like, I just want relationship. And that is such a godly progression that I just want to name, that in the process of this, give yourself grace, move through, do the things you need to do, but then go back to the table. Don't leave the table. So, that was great. So 3 things that McKnight lays out, kind of 3 core practices that he thinks matters when we're trying to do atonement in action. And they're sacramental. And it's interesting, right? Because what you believe about the sacraments, or some traditions hold these things as ordinances. Some hold them as symbols. Others hold them as sacraments, but he's coming from a sacramental space. So these three kind of sacramental participations for him are baptism, Eucharist, and prayer. These, for him and for me, aren't just rituals. And they're not just religious habits, but they're tangible, embodied acts of atonement. So part of what baptism teaches in all the traditions I've been a part of is there's this dying to one reality and being birthed into a new one. It's not merely a public declaration of faith. It's a funeral and resurrection all in one that we're living into. One of the things that I love about what Martin Luther says about baptism, and it was a huge conversion point for me for believing very deeply in infant baptism, was that baptism is the purest form of showing God's grace, because that little baby can do nothing to understand its favor in the eyes of God, and yet it has it. And I love that. I love that as an atoning articulation, right? That like, this work is God's work, and we are his children, and our identity as God's children is from the very foundation, and then how we live from that is profound in this. I was baptized by immersion as a kid, and when you go underwater, we would say you are buried in baptism and raised to walk in the newness of life, right? That was part of that mantra. Paul says it in Romans 6:4, we are therefore buried with him through baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may have new life. So when we baptize, we're not just symbolizing something, we're reenacting atonement. We're saying this life is not just my own. I belong to a new creation. I'm part of something bigger than me. Baptism is this entry point into the atoning community. It marks participation in God's mission to set the world right. Second one he names is the Eucharist, this meal that he argues defines us. This open table, this bread, this wine, the broken body, the poured out blood. Jesus lifts the bread and he says, "This is my body broken for you." He lifts the cup, "This is my blood poured out for your forgiveness of all sins." And it's in that moment that we see it. I don't say blood because I don't like that language, right? If you ever watch me on a Sunday. But this is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Atonement is not just an event. It's something that we practice communally here at St. Matthew every Sunday. That we're saying this table is what marks and shapes us and actually prepares us for what's to come in the next week. Right? Alexander Schmemann says, liturgy is life. The things we do on Sunday are actually practices that we're embodying for as we enter into our everyday Monday through Saturday living. There's this truth that we say Sunday, right? That Jesus gave himself away for the sake of the world. Which means that if we're his followers, we're now his body broken for the world. And we don't just receive the meal, but we become the meal. When we take communion, we're saying, God, I accept your atonement, and God, I will live your atonement. This is why in the early church, they called it the Eucharist. It means thanksgiving. But it's a beautiful word because it also encompasses grace and joy. Chara, charis, Eucharist. It's in the grace that we find thanksgiving and live out in joy. Because every time we eat and break the bread, we're reminded this is who we are, this is what we do, and this is how we live. The third one he names is prayer. Prayer isn't just talking to God, it's about facing God. turning our attention, recentering, realigning our desires with God's desires. My favorite C.S. Lewis quote is when he was seen praying as his wife was dying, and they were like, "Why do you pray? It doesn't change anything." And he says, "I don't pray to change the situation. I pray because it changes me. It aligns me to who God is." And prayer isn't just private, it's communal. It pulls us into people, a story, a shared mission. In prayer, we ask, what is God doing and how can we join God? And through that action, it reorients us toward God, towards God's plan, towards justice, toward reconciliation. And this is why we read in Acts 2 that the early church committed themselves to praying together daily. Not just a habit, it's a practice of atonement work they were doing together. A way of staying connected to who God is and what God is doing in God's work. I would add to this that another piece of this work that we're doing is discipleship. Every day we're invited to live into atonement, and we do it when we forgive. We live atonement. Every time we seek reconciliation, we live atonement. Every time we choose love over fear, we live atonement. Every time we stop using the word they, we live atonement. Every time we embody the action and movement of Jesus, we live atonement. Jesus says it this way. He says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple has to deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." And we hear that, and I think often we just immediately put on suffering in that space. But it's deeper than that. Take up your cross means choosing love and choosing to keep moving forward even though you know choosing love is going to get you in trouble. Choosing reconciliation even when it might make you lose your job. Choosing to lay down your rights for the sake of someone else's healing. This is discipleship. It's part of the work of atonement, not just learning about Jesus, but actually walking into the practice that's there. Trying to live out the words that Jesus preached in his very first sermon, coming out of that text from Isaiah we started with. And we can talk about the rest of worship and church life that we live out today. Right? I think the thing that the church learned, or should have learned, post-COVID, was somehow between a moment in time and where we ended up, the church became an entertainment company. And what happened during COVID was we learned that there were a lot better entertainment companies than us. Because there's a lot of really good preachers out there. You don't have to come here to hear me. You can hear way better people than me on a Sunday morning. And there are a lot of way better worship teams and pick your format the way that you like. And you can watch 27 of them on a Sunday and get fully filled up in your spiritual entertainment. But that wasn't what church is meant to be. Church isn't a spectator event. It's not a weekly show where you listen to music and hear a sermon. Church is a community of atonement where people come to be healed and are sent out as healers. Which means worship isn't about singing songs. It's about those songs forming us and being formed into people who live out this atonement work. And preaching isn't just about learning the theology of the pastor you're listening to. It's about being shaped into a story of reconciliation. And gathering isn't just about being with your friends in your coffee clutch. It's about becoming the kind of community that the world needs to see. McKnight puts it this way: the church is to be a fellowship that creates opportunity for atonement by living out the gospel life that it itself is atoning. So what does that look like? It looks like churches feeding the hungry, not as outreach programs, but as a part of their core identity. It looks like churches welcoming a stranger, people who look different than them, act different than them, think different than them, because atonement is about bringing people into a family. It's like being really uncomfortable if all of your church is the same age and the same color and the same socioeconomic class, and doing everything in your power to make sure that's not true, because it is a community of atonement. And it looks like churches fighting for justice and doing the hard work, not as a political stance or even, specifically not as a partisan stance, but as a gospel reality that all people are beloved children of the divine. And our work isn't done until that's understood, even if we don't understand the identity of those who are asking to be seen as children. Because atonement is about what Jesus did. But it is also about what we do because of what Jesus did. So, thoughts. Another invitation.
I agree with all of that.
Amen.
One of the interesting things when we first came here, we're used to taking communion differently, right? So the Eucharist and being here, we've commented to people that, from down in San Diego that we used to worship with, like, we do communion, we receive communion every week. It's awesome. Sharon and I sit on the front row, we just watch everybody, and we're just like blown away by it. It's life-changing, and it has been life-changing for us to watch that and to see a different way of partaking, right? A different way of receiving communion. And so it's been great, and I agree that it's not just about what he did for us, it's us going in and becoming, taking on that ministry of reconciliation to the world. It's huge.
Yeah. Yeah, communion's my favorite part of the service. Because nothing to do with me. Julia.
Just thinking a little bit about the earlier conversation about, people finding what other people say hurtful, and I think we just all have everyone has their own perspective, right, and sensitivities. Like, I went to a church with a friend in Germany, and he was super traumatized, and I was not, and I think it's just his own background and how he perceived it and being way more sensitive, but really what matters is what happens then when somebody lets you know, I'm really hurt by what you said, or by how you categorize things, right? Are you willing to adjust, not just in general, so you never make a mistake, but are you willing to change, or say, oh, let me hear your story and understand it from your point of view,
Yeah.
and, right? And so that's really the difficult part, because sometimes when people just double down and say, well, that's how I see it, that's true, you just deal with it, you can't handle the truth, and that's often where the hurt happens. But it is
Yeah.
like, oh, I didn't realize that, what I'm finding just natural or normal or healthy, it sounds really, really hurtful to you. What do I do next? Right?
Yeah.
And I get that feedback.
I thank you for that, Julia. Yeah, I think one of the things that we should be teaching in the Big C Church is a movement back towards curiosity versus suspicion. We've been stuck in suspicion for so long, and it's not helping us, and it's not helping our world. And so how do we make movements towards curiosity is, I think, a piece that, a spiritual practice that we can embody in this. One of my favorite Brian McLaren practices, Brian is in, if you don't know who he is, he's a theologian, previous pastor, but he also wrote a foreword for your book, not to bring it back to your book, but he says his favorite phrase is, "That's interesting. I see the world different than that. And he says the beautiful part about that phrase is it names that you have a different vision, but it also invites somebody else to say, well, how do you see it differently? And he said the other part of that practice for him is when people say that to him, he requires himself to ask, well, how do you see it? Because he says 90% of the time, nobody ever says to him, well, then how do you see it? Because we've lost the curiosity. And so I just love that I think it's really helpful. Because I think often what I do is I see it differently than that. Let me tell you how it's different and why my way is better. This is like every Thanksgiving in my house, which is why I have Thanksgiving here most of the time. That's not true. My parents are awesome, but it's a part of that, right? So I think it's a good space.
Kind of building on that, going back to some of the things that Mike was saying, I have seen that my spiritual journey has taken me through, to a different place now than I was before. And I have realized the importance of humility, too, because I just know a number of people who hold very different beliefs, or they see Christianity differently than I do now, and it is really tempting for me, and I have to be aware of that tendency to want to look at them as they. Well, those stupid people that aren't as enlightened as I am. And that, it's easy to slide into that, and to realize, whoa. Jesus loved you when you thought that way, and you were like that. He loves you now, and you may have more enlightenment to come. And I have to be so careful, because I think, well, they may see things I don't see that I need to see.
Yeah.
And it's just, it makes me aware, especially when I hear someone I don't agree with who's really harsh. It's like, we don't do that. Don't go there. Because I ask God so often to help me keep my heart soft towards others.
It's a beautiful prayer.
That's not my normal tendency to go.
Yeah, it's a beautiful prayer. Yeah, it's why I literally start every class I've ever taught in, clearly not an English class, I've ever taught with the quote by Teilhard de Chardin, who says, my prayer is that God sees the theology that we're doing today with the same joy and happiness as he sees a dung beetle rolling around in the shit. It's like we take this like so seriously, and I think we're all gonna end up there and be like, oh, that was so different than what I thought. And they're here? Like, okay. I just think it's just gonna be a very different wedding banquet than we think. Yeah.
If you're interested in practicing what we're talking about right now, there's a guy who's actually put together a series of opportunities to do this in a safe environment online called 3 Practices. If you want to just show up, it's number 3, practices.com. He's a great former pastor among the family former pastors. And the 3 practices are, I'd be curious to know, to stay in the room with difference, and to stop comparing my best with your worst. 3practices.com.
Yeah, it's great.
I wanted to add something to this whole thing. First of all, I wanted to just throw some praise onto you of how, the title is Community Called Atonement, and you have managed to make this lecture series a thing that just lets everybody kind of all participate, and that is not nothing. I don't think I've been to a lecture series, and I've been to a lot of lecture series, where where that kind of conversation happens, you know, both during and after. There's just been so much relationship and community, you know, that's come through this. It's really kind of amazing to me that it's just your pastoral gift that you're able to kind of you know, there's people who can do a talk, and then there's people who can kind of let other people also participate and make that conversation happen, and it's really something super special.
Thank you.
Amen. It's okay to say amen.
Thank you.
Also, I want to say I appreciate you saying what you said, and I am taking it, and I hope this is how you would like me to take it. I'm not taking it in kind of the, you know, there's like sort of on the, I don't know, call it the world of TikTok, right? Which is probably none of our worlds. I don't watch TikTok. But there's this kind of thing of like, you know, like, don't offend me, and, you know, say the right thing, and then, I don't know, just pick a topic, racism. It basically just makes it so like, okay, let's just not talk about that at all for fear of one person or the other person saying something that hurts the other person's feelings, and then you don't get to work through it, right? And so, and I don't think you meant it that way, like, you know, I can't say things. But I do appreciate that you're also saying things, and so that I can, because I also want to, I think you and I both want to communicate with grace towards each other. And I think that and when you're dealing with things that are hard and traumatic, like racism, but also just like the divisions in our country, the divisions within what I've called home at church for 30 years, that there's real trauma there. And it hurts to go through there. And I think the only way to go through that is just that we're all, you know, that we're not just, none of us are just like quietly taking it and listening, but we all have a voice. We're all allowed to say, hold on, slow down a little bit there, you know, and then, but not stop the conversation. And I think that, anyway, I thank you for making that happen.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, that's important stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking about relationships. I'm sorry to, you know, but that's
No, please,
really
yeah.
important. And that's exactly how I just, we're in it, right? We're here for a reason. We're here, and we've immersed ourselves in this church, and we're happy to be here and to call this our church. And we're hearing things that we've never heard before in some instances.
Yeah.
Not in all instances.
No, yeah.
But in some instances. And so,
I'm saying things I never said before. So
Yeah. But so I appreciate you saying that. I certainly, you know, all I can do right now is like I go back to my daughter, right? The whole point of what I said to start with was that we desire a relationship with our daughter, so we had to change, at least initially, how we said things so that we could continue the conversation. Right? So our whole desire, she's coming to see us in 2 weeks, we can't wait, you know, and we don't get to see her all the time, but that wouldn't happen if we weren't willing to make some adjustments to accommodate, not that we're going to placate to somebody because we've got hurt feelings or something like that, but that we are respectful of others that maybe have a different perspective. That was my whole thing.
Yeah, and the greatest gift my therapist ever gave me was the question of, would you rather be right or would you rather be in relationship? And I think when you start to understand sin as the failure to bother to love, and sin as any breach in relationship whatsoever, then what you realize is that being right doesn't matter. It's all constructions that we've made up in our head anyway. And so we're all like handing, and I love being right. Ask my wife. Like this is, and it's why it's the greatest gift my therapist ever gave me, is because it literally is my mantra every moment. Because I love being right. But what I've learned over time is that what I long for is to be in relationship. And what changes my soul is being in relationship. And what unites me with the divine is being in relationship. I do not know God apart from you. I don't. You might have experiences of God apart from people. I don't. It's how I'm wired. And so in that, like the conversations that we have together, like I'm being formed in such powerful ways by listening to you and being a part of this conversation. And it's why I think these things are so important, and why I think it's a shame that we stop doing them once we've been confirmed. Because we abandon the playing in the sandbox.
I mean, 3 years ago, it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we started the idea of, creating conversations around this and courageous conversations and all that. Was the whole purpose of it was, can we create a place where people can say what's really on their mind and have a safe place where we can have discussion and dialogue around it with no one being wrong or offended. And to hear what you guys have said tonight, it's really awesome, because it's been a long, process of getting to this place, and so it's cool to hear that. And my only feedback is I was hoping you would cuss more. But
You got 2 tonight. That's all you get. I'm working on that in public spaces, not in private ones. So as we conclude this journey together, I just want to pause and take in the fullness of what we've explored. It's not just a series of atonement theories, but a lived reality that calls us deeper into the mystery of God, the work of reconciliation and the transforming of our world. And we've wrestled, many of us, with atonement in a multitude of frames, and whether it's substitution or victory or satisfaction or liberation or suffering or solidarity. And we've traced how these historical moments shape our theology. Is that you too? That's perfect. No, you're fine. I thought it was you too. I was like really excited about that. I was like, the streets have no name is what it sounds like. I'm like, this is a perfect song to be playing right now. Can you sing it, Billy, for me now? I didn't mean to call that out. I just really love you too. And I was like, the streets have no name. Couldn't get better of a moment. I mean, sometimes I pay the guys to play behind me. So it works out well. So we've wrestled with atonement's many frames: substitution, victory, sacrifice, liberation, suffering, solidarity, and a bunch of others. But we've also seen how the historical moment shapes the frame. And we also seen how sometimes when your new historical moment is different than the previous one, that frame doesn't work so well in context. And we're challenged to find new ones. And we've asked hard questions. Who does the atonement theory that we hold serve? What kind of world does it create? What kind of God does it generate? Does it lead us deeper into love and justice and reconciliation, or does it lead us into something else? And we've been invited to see atonement not as a transaction, but as an ongoing, unfolding work, one in which we are called to participate. Not a debt paid, but a world healed. Not a sacrifice demanded, but a community restored. And this is where atonement theory moves from theory into practice. It's not something we believe, it's something we live. So here's the challenge. Will we reject theologies that tell the suffering to endure harder? rather than dismantling the systems that cause their suffering in the first place? Will we move beyond atonement theories that keep the marginalized on the margins? Will we step out of the cycles of scapegoating and instead become a community that heals? Because as James Cone and Dolores Williams and Jonathan Foster remind us, atonement is not about justifying suffering, it's about ending it. And it's about making peace with injustice. And it's about resisting it. Not making peace with injustice and resisting it. It's not about separation, but inclusion and reconciliation and restoration. So if atonement means at one-ment, then it's an invitation to be and a call to be at one with God, to be at one with ourselves, to find a deeper level of wholeness, and also to be at one with each other. And its work isn't done until that's true. And it's an invitation for us to step into the story of Jesus and our world, not as bystanders, but actually as willing, faithful participants. Flaws and all. To be peacemakers in a world addicted to war, to be truth tellers to a world that loves to scapegoat, including us when we use the word they, when we don't even mean to be healers in a world that wounds, to be a community where no one is sacrificed and no one's left behind. We don't write books about that because we don't even believe it, and no one's told about their suffering, that it's for the greater good. Because atonement is worth living for. So as we leave this space, may we not settle for easy answers, but keep asking deeper questions. May we embody a practice of curiosity and stay open and wake up to wonder every day. And may we embody a theological humility that recognizes we're all just making it up. And above all, may we be a people who live atonement, not as a doctrine to be believed, but as a love to be embodied. Amen? Amen. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for adding an extra week so that I can make it through all of them. And thank you for bringing yourselves to this. Again, this isn't our last class. There will be many more to come, and we are grateful for that, and we'll send out more, and we have your info. If you have not received videos and stuff from us, it means that we don't have your email. So don't leave without giving Mike your email. If you want the videos and the content and all that, we've been sending it out every week. But other than that, we'll be around if you have any questions. Go in peace and love our world.